Hello everyone, and thank you for joining this event. And as a Ukrainian myself, I want to say special thanks to those who made donations. You're the best. Today we're going to speak about a really complicated topic with a cryptic name, local state and server cache, finding a balance. You're probably wondering what's the difference, what is local state, what is server cache, but we will find out during the talk. And first, let me quickly reintroduce myself. My name is Natalia, and I'm Vue.js core team member. I work mostly on Vue documentation. I'm also a staff front-end engineer at GitLab and a Google developer expert in web technologies. And considering the first title, the examples in this talk will be more Vue specific, but this talk can be applied to any kind of a framework. And it actually was inspired mostly by React ecosystem. So let's start. First of all, let's think for a moment about the global state of your application. What is a global state? This is obviously some data that you need to share across your application. So different components, different routes can have an access to the same data that you keep in your global state. I believe every single developer that listens right now to this talk had worked with a global state at least once, but let's reiterate just to remind you how it works, and also I will give an example in Vue. So for example, we want to have a counter in our global state to be accessed somewhere in the application. And first, of course, we create a state property, count. And we need to change the count somewhere in the application lifecycle. So we add a mutation that increments the count in this particular case. And if you were using Vuex, our common state manager for Vue before the last version, you would also create an action. Actions were added to handle asynchronous operation, and you shouldn't be using them all the time. This was a very common way of doing things. So whenever you have a component, you could only dispatch an action, not directly accessing the mutation. Right now, with the new state manager Pinia, it's a bit different, but still you would need to create something to modify your state property. It looks quite simple, right? Even with the action boilerplate. The problem is we are dealing here with a very specific kind of local state. First of all, the change we're doing is synchronous. By simply clicking on the button and incrementing the counter. Second, this state is not persistent. Whenever you refresh the page, you will have your counter at 0. Third, it has only one source of changes. You create an application, you establish the property count, and then you modify it with your mutation that is also a part of your application. So your app is the only one source of changes in this particular case. And also it does not create a lot of boilerplate. Arguably because we had an action here, but it's still very straightforward. If you read the code, you understand what is going on here. However, real applications very rarely exist without any accessing of the server data. So we need to have an API calls. And let's try to have a look how this will affect our global state whenever we add server data here. So let's say that we have characters. As an array of characters we will be working with in our application. And your mutation receives some kind of a payload, and you save these characters this payload to state characters. And of course, in Vuex you had an asynchronous section because mutations were only synchronous, where you're fetching the characters, you're waiting for some API call, and then committing the mutation. Still looks quite doable, but we need to handle loading state, because here we're dealing with a synchronous operation. We wouldn't have data immediately when we requested characters. So you need to display some kind of a loading indicator in your app. So we add two more properties because also we need to handle errors. So now we have a loading and error in our state. And one mutation becomes three mutations because we have three different cases. First, we start the request. We set the loading state to true. We set error to null, and we are waiting for the result. And then we have a fork, like basically two branches, success and error. And in the success case, we are setting loading to false, error to null, and we set characters. And in error, we need to display an error. And now we are also working with try-catch. So we are trying to get the characters. When there is an error, we can make this mutation. And this creates a lot of boilerplate, in all fairness. Because our tools for handling the local state are not really designed to work with asynchronous operations and with something that is persisting on the server. And it brings us a bunch of other problems. First, very common question happens with every state manager. How to fetch data only when it's not present in the local state? It happened to me when I was using Redux, Mobex, Vuex, any kind of the state manager. So you're performing a manual check. If data is present in your state, you're not doing an API call. If there is no data, you're doing an API call. And in Vuex, it was especially painful because people are using getters sometimes to retrieve the data from the state, and they were trying to squeeze a side effect into getter with this check, which is very bad. Never put any side effects in getters. How to keep my data up to date? Because we just have created a snapshot of the server in our local application. And now we need somehow to make sure that this snapshot is updated. Of course, when you're sending post requests or GraphQL mutations to the server, you're probably updating your app. But you cannot control the server, and you need to deal somehow with the fact that data on your server are changing. It can be polling, it can be WebSockets, it can be trying to expire your local cache. But again, all these solutions you would need to do manually when using a typical local state manager. What if two components start fetching simultaneously? Again, this is a very common case that we have a few components that need the same data. They perform this check. The data is not in the cache. And then these components start the action to fetch the data, and we need to deduplicate this. So we need to cancel the second request. And again, we need to do this manually. All these problems come from the common root that we are dealing here with asynchronous operations, with a state that is persisted remotely, so somewhere on the server, somewhere outside of the reach of front-end developer. And this data has a shared ownership. So you can change the data on the server. Someone else can change data on the server via the API. Data can be changed on the server even without the API calls by directly modifying a database. And you need somehow to ensure that you still have the freshest data in your front-end application. Not all states are born equal. There is a big difference with something that is local, client-only state. It is not persistent, and something that we are using as a snapshot of our server state. That's why the name of my talk actually has this distinction: local state and server cache. And we need to deal with both, usually in the application. So we have a global state, how we used to think about it, something that is shared across components, but in fact we have local state and server cache. From my experience in the applications I've been working on, server cache is around 80% of the data, sometimes even more, that we have in our app. And if you think about cart in the shop, even the cart is usually synchronized with the server. So whenever you put any goods to your cart in the internet store and refresh the page, you will see they are still there because we're either using local storage or we already send a request to the server notifying that user has this good in the cart. And local state, sometimes it's enough to move completely to the server cache and have local state in the components. Sometimes you still need a state manager that is handling local state. The server cache, I think the first time I've been working with server cache actively was Apollo client. And this is very common for those of you who had been using GraphQL extensively in your applications. Because Apollo client is capable of caching the data automatically with their default policy, cache first. So whenever you're fetching your data from the GraphQL API, Apollo is storing them in the cache. Whenever you modify them, these changes are reflected in the cache. So it's quite simple. If we look at the GraphQL API, you have a library for the integration. For Vue, it's Vue Apollo. For React, it's just Apollo, and you have your result loading an error just using the query composable. And imagine that we have this kind of the query where we're fetching the ID, name, and description of the character. Of course, we can still handle the data that are fetched not even from GraphQL, but this becomes complicated. If you look at this resolver, you can see that we're already doing lots of black magic only to put the characters array to the right shape. And now even worse. Imagine if we want to modify the data locally. So simply replacing the array of existing characters with adding one new character. This is how mutation resolver would look like in the Apollo client. And remember, I was speaking about the boilerplate. Here is a boilerplate again. So when we want to modify things, this very local thing, it becomes problematic. Apollo is super focused on utilizing the server cache, but they have a lot of pain when you're working with a purely local state. One size doesn't fit all. It seems like it's super hard to invent a silver bullet that works perfectly with a local state and as perfectly with a server cache. So maybe we shouldn't have one tool to resolve two very different tasks. And with this, I'll come to the demo of the tool. For Vue users, it's called vue-query. And vue-query is an integration built on top of React query, of the core of React query, actually. So I believe that we can best explain these things with a live demo. So here we go. For the purpose of software demo, I will be using this simple app that will be fetching the characters of Dune, because I like Dune, so why not? And I'm running the local server for this. Currently, there is nothing in our front page, but we will be working on it to see how we can work with the server cache in the application. Now let's go to the code, and first, let's see what I already have in my API.js. And this is simply a few methods that are using Axios under the hood and that allow us to fetch characters and one specific character by ID. And also there is a post request to add a new character. So let's go to our home view and start working on this. For now, you can see that I have all these placeholders just to have loading and error characters. And now we start replacing them. So first, I will start with just fetching data for characters list from our API using the vue-query composables. So there is a const. So there is const result, and we will use it as use query. We need to give the key to our query a name of this query. And with this name, we will be able to access this query later. You will see in the demo. So let's call it characters. And now we need to tell our use query what we're using to actually fetch the characters. And for me, it will be get characters. Let's put this to the console. Console log result. And let's go to our application and see what do we have here. And there is an object that contains actually contains a lot of things like is fetching, is idle, is loading. But for now, we are interested in data. You can say that this is ref implementation, meaning this object is reactive and it updates whenever we have the data. It has the value, which is a proxy, and we can work with this value trying to see what's going on here. If we take a look at the network request here, and I will refresh the page, you can see that we are fetching characters, and this is what our data contains. So this is an array of June characters. As you can see, data is reactive object. And this is just one property of the result. So I'll start with the structuring. And if I put the console log here now, I will probably have data value as undefined because it will be synchronous operation while I'm still waiting for use query to resolve. I need to have a reactive property that depends on the data. So I could track the changes and reflect them properly. I will use vue-computed for this to derive the data that I need from the data object. So this will be a computed equal to data value, if it already exists, data. We have value here simply because this is vue-ref, and vue-ref is a reactive object with a single property value. And we have this weird structure with data because I have a typical REST API that has a response with like data status and all the goodness. I will delete characters here. Let's go back to our page, and as you can see, we are fetching a list of characters here. Nothing super magical. We just use the same that we would have using Axios. Let's also add is loading and is error here, because use query is smart enough to return the loading and error states for us. So we don't need to track them manually. And with this, we can remove these options and check again what's going on. There is a super short moment you can see loading here. I will change to fast 3G. So there is a loading state, as you can see, and it just works. And let's also change the URL here. So we will have an error. And here is something interesting happens. Let me refresh the page to show you. 1, 2, 3. So there are 3 retries and we're still in the loading state. And after this, the API actually throws an error. This is a default behavior of the vue query. If the response is not obtained, if there is an error in the API, it will retry 3 times before actually throwing an error. This behavior, of course, is completely modifiable. So if I would like to say that, nope, I want, okay, I've done something bad. So if I want to say that I want only to retry 1 time, let me refresh the page. There is 1 retry and then an error. There is one more interesting thing. Let me clear the console here. I'm changing the focus and turning back. And here is a refetch. Again, this is default of vue-query. Whenever you have the window focus changing, it considers your data stale and starts refetching. And again, this is completely modifiable. So refetch and window focus false. Okay, window focus, and we're not refetching anymore. Let me restore my characters. And for the sake of playing around the cache, because right now we are just fetching data, I would also like to add the query for a single character, because currently we're doing nothing. It's very similar to what we have already done. So here in the character view, I will also have the data, and it's loading. This will be use query, and it's a bit more complicated syntax, because first argument will be an array where we're defining the key of the query and the parameter for the query, because we will be using ID to fetch a certain character. So here we go, character, and the ID of the character will be props ID. If you think about what the props magic is, we actually have a view router that is passing the ID dynamic part of the root as a prop to the component. So this will be, let me show you in the browser, this will be this part. So we are dealing with ID 1 here. And now we need a second parameter. In this particular case, we want to call getCharacter with the parameter, with the prop ID. That's why it will be a callback. So getCharacter, not characters anymore, and we are passing props ID here. Now we have data, and we need to extract the character from it. So const character will be the same computed property that we had. And we want to return data, value, data. And of course, I need to remove placeholders. So right now, as you can see, we have all traders here, Johnny or Jessica. But there is something wrong going here. Let's look at the network tab again. I'm fetching characters. Okay. I'm fetching the details for Paul. Still okay. I return to the main page and I'm fetching characters again. Why this is happening? Where is my server cache? Why I did through that much trouble just to have the Axios working? Again, vue-query as a React query as well, it has very aggressive defaults. And by default, it thinks that your data in the cache are stale. And when the data is stale, you need to refetch. And it considers data stale in very many actions. So it would be component remounting, window refocus, we disabled it, but still by default it is. Creating a new query and many other things. So now we need to tell the cache that we want this data to persist for some time. And I will say that I want data to persist for 20 seconds, and after 20 seconds, you can consider the data being stale. To do so, we will go to main.js where I'm setting the view query and say stale time 20 seconds. Let's go to the app again. I'm fetching characters, fetching Paul, come back to the main, characters is here, Paul is here too. But if I go for Chani, of course, it's not in the cache, so we are fetching it again. Now let's just switch between them for like 20 seconds. Waiting a bit. And now we're fetching Paul, fetching characters because the data is stale. Chani is still here because we accessed her a bit later. But now it's stale as well. Of course, you can modify this in a very different ways. you can make it like 5 minutes for stale time. And this is already amazing because you have a cache. And whenever you are hitting the API, in fact, first you will retrieve the data from the cache of the view query. One more thing is, let's take a look at how we are modifying the cache. Like, if I make a request to the API, I want the data to be modified in the cache as well. Like we would do this for Vuex or Redux or MobX. You have a successful response of the post request or mutation, and you need to modify the cache. So I will go to my home view and write the mutation as well. I like that the names in Vue and React query are very similar to what we have in Apollo. So now we need to create a mutation. And we have a hook for this called, obviously, use mutation. Here we don't need a key, we only need to pass a callback. So I would call add character, and it requires passing a new character. So we need to create some placeholder. Let's call new char. That is just an object with an ID and name. And we are passing this new char here. So far, this is non-reactive object, just an object to test the mutation. Now we need to return this mutation from our setup, and now we can use it here in the template. I will just add a button, add character, and on button click, I will just call my mutate. Now let's go and see how this works. I'm clicking add character, and as you can see, we have a post request that added a character with ID 11 and name test. Nothing is changed in the UI. Let's refresh the page and you can see that we have a test here. So we need also to modify our UI after we made this. So we need to modify our cache because our UI is reactive to the cache changes. Let's change the ID because otherwise it will complain that we already have an entry with this ID. And let's add one more thing here. So whenever the mutation is successful, we want to modify the cache. How do we access the cache? For this, we will need a client instance. Use query client. And now we can say that query client set query data characters. So this is here. This is where we are using the key we defined for our query. And of course, we need to define the data. And data in this particular case would be the whole characters array that we have, value, because this is the reactive view object, and also res data, so the ID and name that we get in the response. Let's check. And here we go. Here is immediate change in our UI because we modified the cache. Last words is this library, React Query, Vue Query, can be used in combination with any state manager. So if you have something that is coming from the server, you access it through the Vue Query or React Query cache. If you have totally local data, you can use the state manager of your choice, and or from my experience, sometimes you don't need the local state. You realize that all the data that you needed to share within your application were already coming from the API. And I really like that it's super agnostic to the data source. Because if you're going to use a Apollo client, it's very inclined towards GraphQL. Yes, you can make it working with REST. It's complicated. Here, you can define your API methods like I did with the Axios calls. And this can be just anything, basically anything that modifies your cache. Thank you for your attention.